As part of IMA International's ongoing Monitoring, Evaluation and Learning Forum, Guy Sharrock generously offered to facilitate an event on embedding monitoring, evaluation, accountability and learning policies and procedures in agency practice.
So what I'm hoping we'll do this afternoon is just hear about really our ongoing experiences, and I emphasise the word ongoing experiences. It's clearly a learning process for us, and you'll hear a little bit more about that. But also I'm interested to hear others' experiences. One of the nice things about the Mel Forum is it's an opportunity to hear what others are doing with regard to this particular topic this afternoon. So I think that'll be very interesting for us. And then really just to sort of pull out any learning points that are of value to any of us. CRS, we focus very much on sort of development programming and humanitarian programming. So some of this may be more or less applicable to the different agencies that are here today. But bear with us, because you may in your own mind have to make a sort of mental shift. How would this work in ours? And that actually is going to be one of our activities to start off with.
At this point, participants split into small groups to discuss what might be the potential opportunities and challenges of embedding meal policies and procedures in agency practice. They wrote them down and added them to a shared wall for discussion. Here is what was contributed. Please feel free to pause the video and read them, and if you have any to add, please add them in the comments below.
These are all excellent. I think the opportunities, yes, I would say this is in part what drove us seeing this, what we're doing. So what I'm going to do is just tell you a little bit about sort of our story. And I think the thing I would say right at the start is, I know it's the obvious point, but every agency is different. So I'm not sure there's a right or a wrong way to do this. So I'm sort of going to talk about the CRS story, how we've done it, but it's not a prescription for how you should do it. It's just the way we've chosen to do it. And as I say, it's very much, and I think this is an important point, it's an obvious one, it's a learning problem, it's a learning challenge, if you like. So we don't necessarily have all the answers, but we're committed to sort of figuring out as we go forward with it. So that's one point on there. On the challenges, I'll try and speak to some of these, because some of these, or most of these, resonate with what we're facing in CRS and what we've tried to overcome and how we've dealt with it and so on. So I'll try and pull out some of these, as many as I can, in just describing what we've done. So thank you very much for that. It's good just to, there's a sense that you obviously are thinking about this. I've got some sort of really good ideas on, the upsides and the downsides for it. And like all of these kinds of interventions, they're challenging, and there are consequences that we can't predict necessarily before we start out. So unlike necessarily having a sort of a log frame for introducing policies and procedures, it's very difficult to know how they're going to, what the impact is going to be, what challenges will arise. And so part of our thing is really figuring that out and sort of, if you like, learning by doing. So just to say a little bit about sort of where we were coming from, I think there was a sense, so I've been with the agency quite a while now, and whilst we were producing sort of, we were producing sort of guidance on how to do sort of basic M&E, how to build in M&E into project design, setting up monitoring systems. So once an award has been made and you turn up on a Monday morning, how do you actually set up a monitoring system? Doing all that, there seemed to be a sort of a sense of ad hocery to it. So there wasn't a sort of a systematic approach. And we're an agency, I don't know the precise numbers, but we've got a lot of country programs in different regions of the world, and there was a sense that people were doing things differently. So what might be going on in our Bolivia office wasn't the same as our Cambodia office, was different from Zimbabwe, etc., etc. It didn't sort of fit. There was a sort of sense of dissonance in the way we were trying to think about doing M&E. there was very much a focus on just being accountable to the donors. So this sense, oh, well, we're only doing it just to keep the donors happy. So no real sense of ownership about doing M&E. Conflict of interest, so I think that was talked about in terms of time, the money side, people weren't giving it priority, they didn't see the value of it, lack of expertise, the capacity issue, the funding issue, really trying to sort of wrestle with that, and no real penalty for poor quality response. This was quite a while ago, but the sense that actually if the people we were trying to serve really did say, this isn't what we want, would we have made any change? Did we know what was going on beyond just collecting data and passing it up to our donors? So not really given high profile, given priority across the board. And this didn't seem right, and that's why we've just, that little sort of diagram there, it was seen as a bit of a burden. I think we've changed that now. So there is a sort of a sense of a cultural shift. I think people, I'm talking generally, and I'm not trying to gloss over the challenges we've had, but I think generally speaking, people do see the value of M&E. And whilst I agree that sometimes donors can push us in directions that we don't necessarily want to go, I actually think sometimes donors can push us in the right direction and make us take seriously things that we wouldn't necessarily give priority. And I think M&E, quite a while ago, was one of those. It suddenly came back onto the agenda after an absence. It was pretty high profile in the late 70s, early 80s, with the World Bank doing these big integrated rural development projects. It sort of then went off the agenda, but then came back in and has stayed around. So things were changing. The external environment was changing, and as a result of that nudging, I think sort of the internal views of M&E were changing. What happened more recently, back in 2013, 2014, we actually changed, and it's interesting seeing all the different titles that people have. Some are M&E advisors, some are MEL, some are MEAL, some are impact, and so on. So lots of different ways of sort of understanding this broad sort of subject area, if you like. We shifted overnight, if you like, from M&E to MEAL with the accountability and learning bit at the added to it. And there was a sense that as we started to think about accountability, we didn't want it just to be about accountability to donors. It was really important that we did give time, give sort of thought to accountability to other stakeholders, most particularly to people we're trying to serve, but also to other stakeholders as well. And this point about the learning, and that came up a number of times about learning, getting people to sort of find the ways and means to start being more intentional about learning. So actually putting that in our job titles suddenly started to give us a reason for spending time to think about it. How could we shift the balance so that there was more intentionality about learning? And I think it probably reflected a larger shift that's going on in aid at the moment. I mean, all the talk at the moment around responsive and adaptive management, all the complexity discourse that's going on, etc., etc. I think there's a shift in the way that all the community, ourselves, donors, governments, partners, etc., etc., are thinking about doing M&E, that it's not just about collecting data and reporting, it's using that data, and that came up as an opportunity and as a challenge, is collecting the right data, the right amount of data, the right things, and using that to make decisions. There's lots going on, but I do think this is a big shift in the industry at the moment. So, just as a very sort of snapshot of our MEAL sort of system, if you like, it's not really a system, but it sort of captures how we are thinking about the relationship between monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning. So just trying to see this as an integrated thing. It's not monitoring or evaluation or accountability or learning. They're all sort of working and in support of each other. So it's quite sort of complicated in that sense. But a key thing in the middle, and I think it came up as a challenge about the IT systems, about how you manage knowledge, how you have platforms and other ways of managing knowledge. That's a key part of, really for us, helping to make the policies and procedures, helping us to embed them and to make them sustainable. I think there was a thing here about consistency that came up and the opportunity for that being more systematic. Our tagline was very much, we're looking for a CRS way of doing meal. Not necessarily the best way, the right way, the only way, but there was a sense of we want it to be, this is the way we want to do meal. Now, we're not naive enough to say we could just do our own thing, because of course we rely on funding, external funding from donors, foundations, private individuals, etc., etc., etc. But there was a sense that we wanted, if you were working in a country and you got transferred, or if you were communicating, and the language thing actually is a key thing here, there was a desire to have a sort of a common language, a common sense of what meal was about. We found that worked when we brought out our first guide and started talking the language of meal all those years ago. And I think having that common language, just as you pointed out, was really important for us. It's important as well if you've got staff who are moving around the agency. And so maybe 1 year they're working in a particular country program, 3 years later they move on somewhere else to another job, but they're still doing something around meal, knowing that wherever they go there's some commonality. Again, picking up the thing about imposing this, I think our sense was, actually as meal, quote, experts, we thought we do want a baseline, we want a sort of a standard that we're going to try and achieve here, but at the same time we recognise locally that there needs to be room for people to innovate, do their thing, so long as they're getting the basics right. And of course that wasn't without being contentious. I mean, there were many discussions, long discussions, meetings, conferences, etc., etc., etc. But there was a sense that just as within agriculture or health and nutrition, there's a sort of a base knowledge that we felt in the case of meal was important to put in place. And then sure, leave space for doing what works locally, innovating, adapting what we've originally suggested. So really trying to capture this idea of minimum requirements. What we've done with our policies and procedures is we've written them so we do funding for programs, for projects, but also in terms of emergency response, humanitarian response. So we've written the policies and procedures in response to those two different aspects of our work. And our sense is that they should apply regardless of donor funding or funding source. So one of the things we say is if the donors have particular demands and they go beyond our policies and procedures, clearly you have to meet those. The donors, you need to meet their demands. If we're using their money, their resources and so on, we have to meet those demands. There's no question about that. But if the donor demands, and here's the case with a number of donors, perhaps some foundations we work with, some partners we work with, they don't set this standard, then we say you still need to meet this particular standard we're setting. We want to have that as our minimum required standard for meal. I've talked a little bit about trying to get this consistency and really just, I think, picking up on the learning points that came up, trying to sort of use this as a way effectively of changing culture and changing organisational culture, particularly with this large oil tanker of an organisation like CRS, isn't easy. But I actually think this is one of the vehicles for trying to do that, is actually getting people to start thinking more intentionally about using data and use it for learning, using it to adapt programs and responses in emergency settings.
I can ask, will you share this in the forum?
Yes, of course. So we talked loosely, if you like, but we said, look, this is a big shift for the agency. We're not going to reach for the stars straight away. You know, there's all sorts of fancy things you can do and so on and so forth. What we're going to do is aim for what we call a bronze level. You know, just get our foot on the ladder. change the culture, do something, just do something, see how it goes, respond and adapt and learn by doing it. So when we set these, and this was a result of, we started work on this in 2013, and they didn't actually go live until October 2015. Just stepping back a little bit from that, we'd been asking our policy people in CRS for a good number of years before 2013, should we have an M&E policy, as it was called, an M&E, now NEAL. And they kept pushing back and saying, if you're going to have a policy, you need to be able to support the machinery that's going to sustain it. In other words, how are you going to know if people are following it, etc. What we didn't want, as I'm sure it's true with yourselves, is a piece of paper that had really highfalutin policies in and statements and procedures. Everybody thought, this is fabulous, and then just put it in a drawer and forget about it. We actually wanted this to be doable. And so we kept taking their advice, and we started off by setting standards. We had some standards just to sort of ease the agency's way into this. And then in 2013, and I think this is telling, this point here about onboarding management. We were having a meeting in Baltimore, our headquarters, and we invited one of our executive vice presidents to come in and just listen to what we were talking about in the policies. And completely unexpected to me, I was organising the meeting and so on. She turned round and she said, I really want you to go for the policies and procedures now. And I don't know what happened, what caused that shift, but her support actually made a world of difference to us, partly because we felt accountable suddenly. We were accountable up to her for moving this forward, but at the same time, and I don't mean this in a really stick-bashing way, but it ain't half handy to have a VP supporting you if people start pushing back really strongly. It's just a handy political, it's handy political capital to have, that you know you've got support at that highest level. So it sort of worked both ways for us. We felt suddenly under the cosh. Interestingly, and again, this really surprised me, because we thought she was the kind of person who'd say, I want them by yesterday. But actually she turned around and said, I trust you to do this, you're the meal team. Take your time, it's better to spend more time and get them right and do what you did. So we were thinking it was going to take us about 6 months. In the end, it took us 18 months to get there. And the 18 months was all of these discussions around what should the policies and procedures look like, what resources should we put in place to support them, how are we going to, the whole system really, how are we going to track progress in rolling these out, etc., etc. And all of that, even at the end of 18 months, we were sort of scrambling a little bit just to have everything. We'd sort of set ourselves a date and started a new fiscal year. So this stuff, and I think these points are really well taken here about the time, maybe the time thing wasn't meant in this way. Perhaps, the resources, just putting these in place, really, I think if I was being perfectly honest with you, the whole thing's taken more time than I anticipated. Now, maybe I was being somewhat naive about it, but it is, you have to go in with it with your eyes open on it, I think. That would be one of my sort of comments, right? It's not a simple task to do. And you talked earlier, and I know you didn't mean it this way, about language. I mean, with our policies and procedures, everything is in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic. So changes, even to single words, ripple through all the different pieces of the policies and procedures. So things take time. You need resources to support it. It's not a light undertaking. And if you feel as if you don't have the staff to do this, then I would probably caution you, be careful, don't jump into this just think very carefully about the implications. Start small, start simple, etc.,
You do
etc.
situation analysis first of your partners and systems.
Yeah, or maybe pick a smaller area to focus on, do it incrementally, do what works for you, I think, but it isn't a small undertaking. But I think if you're changing organisational culture, perhaps we shouldn't be surprised by that. I mean, that sort of goes with the territory, if you like. Okay, let me just see. So what you have in front of you is our set. 8 policies, 29 procedures. 23 of our procedures are written for projects. We've written the majority of them around how we think projects should undertake monitoring and evaluation. Projects or responses, emergency responses. And 6 are more at country programme level, so the organisational level. I think I've said those other things. So again, there could be more, perhaps, there could be fewer. This is an evolving story, so nothing is fixed in stone. And you can see from your the handout, we have meal design, the monitoring, evaluation, budget, human resources, accountability to beneficiaries, donor accountability, and learning. And if clearly the accountability and the learning piece came in together with that addition of the A and the L at the end of M&E. So, for better or worse, these were the areas that we chose to focus on. And you can see from what I've handed out, you know, there are a different number of procedures for different policies. So the budget one, for example, I think only has 1 procedure. Actually, the budget one, despite only having 1, is probably the most fundamental of them all, is make sure you've got money to do M&E, essentially. Make sure you budget for M&E. We were finding, surprisingly, that staff weren't doing that. And so lo and behold, they were asked to do evaluation, and they'd only budgeted $20,000, and the evaluation's costing whatever, $40,000. You know, so really giving them the resources to do that. One of the things we do, and this may be contentious, so this sense of being judged, threatened, we didn't see it like that. In doing the auditing, we work very closely with our internal auditors who are going around doing financial audits and the country programs. We saw it much more as auditing so we could see where there were gaps and that we could lend support and do capacity and so on. But clearly there's a perception issue there. Just the mere mention of the word audit, you know, get people's hair standing on end. But nonetheless, we worked with the auditors, and the audits that they do are very simple in the sense that all they do, because they're financial auditors, that they just check there are particular pieces of documentation that we have required as part of the policies and procedures. One of the things that we have are good practices, and I'll show those in a minute. So for staff, I earlier said we were setting these at the bronze level. Some people said, but we already do these. And we're saying that's great. But actually, maybe if you want to start moving up to a silver level, you can follow some of the good practices, and I'll show you what we have on that. One of our procedures is making sure every project has an operating manual, if you like, either an electronic one or a physical one, just where everything that's going on around meal in a particular project is kept. It's a sort of, you know, a knowledge management exercise. You know, so what happens when the meal officer suddenly gets sick or leaves the agency? There needs to be a go-to place where people can go in, see what's going on, ask a few questions, but actually basically get a good understanding. That's what the operating manual is. And the responses to the procedures and policies and the documentation goes in that manual as part of that knowledge management process. We do allow, of course, there are always going to be situations where it just doesn't make sense to follow these. Maybe the time is too short, or other reasons, the budget is too low, and so on and so forth. There are extenuating circumstances, but we've sort of set that at a level that people have to argue the case. It's not just a free giveaway. that we actually want to hear what is the extenuating circumstance, and it gets signed off by the country rep. Now this may come across as heavy-handed, and perhaps you're right, and one of the things we're going to be doing over the course of the next 12 months is reviewing whether these approaches are causing challenges and problems that we haven't anticipated. So, for example, an audit trail requirement on one of our procedures is we're saying we want a theory of change, a results framework, a pro frame, a log frame, and a meal narrative within 60 days of the project start. That's just what we expect projects to do. And the procedure there, the operating manual, as per minimum requirements, and there are various things that we have there, is just maintained locally or uploaded to a database that we use for managing knowledge within 120 days. And so those are the way the audit trail requirements are set. And one thing I can give out again, sorry, there's only one copy just over for each group. If you could, oh, sorry, is there's a sort of a timeline. Just go. So there's a timeline. So with the policies and procedures, we've actually created a timeline when we expect country programs or projects to have complied with the procedure. Again, we're not trying to beat people with a stick, and I'll come back to this a bit later on, but it's really trying to give them guidance on really when they should be doing it. And actually, surprisingly to me, most people, not all, but most people have said, actually, you know what, we find this quite helpful. Now we know what we need to do by when. And of course, they don't always meet the deadline. It's spawned a little mini industry of people setting up little Excel sheets where they can do data visualizations to see where they are on the timeline and when they've exceeded, etc., etc. And that can all be shared with colleagues. So it's spawned its own little industry within the agency just to track progress with compliance. But just to go back, so the audit trail requirements, you can see here, this is, so we set up a SharePoint site. I said it took 18 months to really get us to the live point. You can see at the top here, these are the 8 policies: design, monitoring, evaluation, and so on. And then there's just a sort of a home page. If you want to have a check the document, it's there. Key resources to use, things around the meal community, etc., etc. So just various things you can click onto. When you click onto one of these, just in terms of managing knowledge, this is where they've clicked on the monitoring symbol. So it takes them to this page on monitoring. And there are a number of procedures under monitoring. So you can see the first one there, 2.1. So the monitoring has a policy statement, but also a series of procedure statements, and this is the procedure statement here. So we're saying, for monitoring purposes, CRS staff meet with partners on a quarterly basis to jointly analyse and reflect on monitoring data in order to produce action items with assigned responsibilities. So that's the procedure that we're looking for all of our projects to adopt and to take up. What you see underneath there is you see some narrative, because these statements, typical M&E, they're very terse, a bit dry, not particularly nice to read, but we try to give some of the spirit of what lies behind the procedure statement. The audit trail requirement we've talked about, and then the good practices, as I say, just some suggestions. These aren't auditable, but if people doing this in the projects feel this is helpful, they've got the time, the energy, the funding, etc., then they can look at these good practices and follow those through. So that's those, and then you'll just see here what we've done is, in setting this up, is just to provide, and we've tried to minimise, because there's a gazillion documents on monitoring, a gazillion documents on design, etc., but really just provide them what we think are some good go-to documents on whatever the topic is. And then some templates, if that's applicable, so that they're not making up how they're going to capture the quarterly reporting with partners. So, they don't have to sort of think that through, it's just given to them. And then I think this is the one that we need to do more work on, but we've started to get some really nice examples. And I think a lot of people really like this site, is where you can see how people have done it. You know, it's always nice to do that. So we sort of sift through and pick the best ones and stick those into examples. You've seen the timeline. So that's where we've got to. Questions, thoughts?
How do the policies and procedures link into a system? Do you have any shared indicators?
Good question, very good question. We, in terms of common indicators across a portfolio, we're very cautious on that, to be honest with you. We've done a lot of work, and it's probably not, I haven't been directly involved except at the beginning. We've done a lot of work on this thing called beneficiary and service delivery information. So if you like, the basic activity, service delivery level of indicators. And it's, again, it's a bit like the policies. It's amazing how complex that is, because people outside this geeky world, I think, well, surely that's easy, just collecting numbers of people you're serving, how many, you know. But then you get into these sort of fairly arcane discussions about direct beneficiaries, indirect beneficiaries, extended beneficiaries, so on and so forth, and how you count the service delivery, how you avoid double counting, how you do the logistics of it. So we have a system for doing that. It's probably 80-20, if I'm being honest. We have a number that seems to be fairly consistent, I'd say. It goes up and down a little bit. In terms of the higher level indicators, we are very cautious at the moment about trying to measure across projects, partly because it just seems such a minefield, and as we look and scan across different agencies, it's very hard to see an agency that's done that successfully. Well Vision have tried, spent lots of money, and to their credit, were very honest about how much money they'd spent and how it hasn't worked for them. CARE have tried, Mercy Corps have tried, etc., etc. There's some real challenges with it. And I think there's also some conceptual challenges, you know, with those outcome higher level indicators. The higher up you go, you just lose that sense of context. So you get a number, but it actually just begs more questions than it answers, frankly. So we've backed away from it. We're very firmly sitting on the fence on that at the moment. And it's a sort of deliberate place to sit. It's not that we can't make up our mind. I think we're just waiting and watching, letting other people go. So most of the policy and procedures are written around the project level, except a few at the country program level. Those are more around learning agendas, or learning events within country programs.
So is that more qualitative than quantitative?
We can collect, or we simply ask the question, have you had a learning event? What evidence have you had? What have you learned from it? So it's qualitative in that sense, but we can also tot up how many people have done that, how many have not. So it's quantitative and qualitative, to answer your question.
Do you extract the learning from the evaluation reports and make it available in a structured way?
Good question. I think we certainly make the report available. You saw earlier a reference to Gateway, which is one of the platforms we use. So anything connected to a project gets posted there. One of the things I think we're less good at doing at the moment is kind of doing the meta-analyses and pulling together, sifting out some of the learning across different reports. But under the learning, if you have a look in your two-page sheet, under the learning policy, the very last procedure, 8.5, sorry, this is where it does get geeky, you'll see reference to something called past performance references. And what that is for, and certainly our business development folk find it really helpful, is people saying, these are some of the key learnings we've had from this project. And they can pull that from the evaluation, from their own experiences. And it's a short report, and it's something that's available to everybody. Again, it's on the site. and they're sent reminders. The audit requirement is they do it at the end of the project. But here's a good example. One of our good practices is, in other words, it's not compulsory, is we say we think it's a good idea to do this once a year. Just capture what you're learning as you go along. But we haven't made that compulsory.
It's done by the project team.
It's done by the project team, but the evaluation report is most likely at the end of the project to be an external team. So they pull that out and that's available. As I say, the business development people really love it because then they can draw on quite current learning for subsequent proposals, but others use it. But all of these, I mean, I don't want to give the impression it works wonderfully well and every past performance reference you see would be a wonderful mine of learning. We're not there yet. We're on this path of trying to get there, essentially.
Do you have any influencing strategy to roll out with the policies and procedures? Do you train people? Do you target different groups within the organisation?
Yeah, very much so. So in CRS we have a structure. It's quite hierarchical. It's a funny agency in a way. We're very devolved. So I always thought of it as quite feudal because the sort of line management system is very clear. Chief exec, vice presidents, regional director, country director, down to program manager. People like me sort of hover at the edges trying to influence how they should be doing their work. So in some ways it's really a good system for rolling something out. Once you get on board, once you get the management on board, then things just happen. It's a bit like my brother tells me in Japan. It can take forever to make a decision, but once they've made it, out it goes and everybody's doing it pretty quickly. CRS is a bit like that. I wouldn't like to say we're like a Japanese corporate, but there is an element of that because of our hierarchy. But there was a lot of training. So on the meal side, we have a sort of a smallish meal team at headquarters, and then we have regional advisors, and then country programs have meal staff. So that's kind of the training path. But program staff were very much trained with webinars and all the rest of it, and seminars, etc., etc. I'm sure we could have done it better. I think communication is an ongoing. It's always, an ongoing issue about how you communicate. I remember working at what's now DFID. They had a whole registry department, just sort of monitoring sort of policies and procedures for what the big government agency is doing. So, as I say, it's quite a big challenge. I mean, you have to think these things through. It's doable, but perhaps we have resources that other agencies don't do. I won't make any bones about that. But yeah, communication is important, really important, and getting the right people on board. So when the Vice President said, let's have them, that was really a green light for us. It really was. I mean, it just gave us a sense, let's do it. But also she gave us the freedom to develop it in the way that we thought was right. Shall we break for tea and coffee?
The second activity involves splitting into groups again and discussing the differences and similarities between the CRS meal policies and procedures and the participants' own, for discussion in plenary.
So I've mentioned about the auditing, but that's very few countries. I mean, the auditors probably audit, I think it's about 12 countries a year, and we've got 90 plus countries. So, we don't rely on the auditors to tell us how well we're doing. It's actually done through this self-assessment. And it's a subjective thing, make no bones about it. And so we ask people to really tell us, for each procedure, to what extent are they complying. And it's a very basic sort of Excel spreadsheet type of thing. Not at all, somewhat, or completely. And this is where we get into your question about the tick box as well. So what do we mean by those? And there's not an easy thing, so we rely on our regional staff to dig a little bit deeper as they do their visits, and as I do my visits, is have those conversations to see. But nonetheless, it's some data, and it gives us some indication. And my sense is, I may be being a bit naive and optimistic in this sense. But as this beds in, people take it more seriously. It's not in their interests to cheat this system. And that if we can communicate that system in a positive way, that we want to know what problems they're facing so we can come and support them, then, and that will take time to be trusted. I think trust is a real issue, but that they believe that, and they believe it not through what we say, but through our actions, then I think over time that will change. So you can do your compliance rates in all sorts of ways. So you can, there we've just done it at policy level. And then, although we didn't go live until 2015, actually we started, we were in pilot testing and so on and so forth. So you can do tests over time to see what changes you're getting. You can break down the data in all sorts of ways, by procedure, etc., etc. So it doesn't have to just be at policy level, it can be done procedure by procedure. So there's lots of things you can do. And what you have there is just a report that we write now at the end of each year, just to sort of say where we think we are. Now we don't sort of take this necessarily literally. I think it's more looking at it from sort of trends. And if there are perhaps if there are changes in those trends, big leaps forward or backward, it raises eyebrows, and we start to sort of just ask questions in a sort of a gentle way. What can you just tell us a little bit more about what's happening here? And I think it's helpful for our situation that we do have this regional structure, and they travel a lot, I have to say, and they're in pretty good contact. They generally have good relationships with the country staff.
And how do you make sure they don't avoid the third option? Not at all.
Not at all. We leave it to them. And people have been, you can see people, in this case, okay, it's much smaller. In other policies, you'll find it's still very high. So I think there's a sense that if we trust them, they'll trust us. We're not going around saying, oh, we don't believe that number. Maybe naive, and we're learning this, so I'm not sure if this is the right way to do it, but it starts a conversation more than anything.
Just to kind of reiterate something similar, we have a partnership review that we do with partners.
Yeah.
And we have a number of categories, and we review them, and they review themselves, and then we review ourselves, and we review them, and we sit down and do it.
Brilliant.
I think that self-assessment really reinforces that idea of this is about improvement and learning,
Yes.
not about kind of bean counting and finger pointing.
Exactly.
And exactly then what you said, that you use that as a conversation. And I think that's where the trust comes, because once what comes out in those conversations is positively acted upon. Like the first time we did it, there was not suspicion is too strong a word, it was really, really positive, and it actually helped identify and really sort out some really unidentified relationship issues that were there. But as that's gone on, now it's one of the things that the partners have fed back, a number of different partners from a number of different countries that they really, really appreciate. And for them, it underscores the sincerity in what we're saying about wanting our partnership approach to be genuine and for it to be kind of more as level as it can be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely right. So the numbers are there, what the margins of error are, who knows? We don't do heavy statistical analyses around this. The data doesn't warrant it. But I think we think along the same lines. It prompts the conversations and, just brings us closer to having discussions about what's happening.
The incentive which Tier Fund uses with its partners, when normally someone from the country office would go to the office of the partner organization and start filling in the form, they complete the form, they check the systems, the procedures. And the incentive we give them is to tell them that actually we are trying to find the areas where the capacity is not that high, so that we can help them develop that capacity to be able to implement our projects properly. That's the incentive. It's not trying to reject the partner because they don't have capacity. It's to help them grow in our partner.
In true internal audit sort of language, they came up, they said it's better we know before the Office of the Inspectorate General in Washington DC where we're having these challenges. Now that's an internal auditor's way of sort of saying the same kind of thing. Let's work out where we've got challenges before anybody else does, so that we can do something about it. So here are just some, I'll try and keep an eye on this here. So successes accepted by staff. What I mean by that is, I think it's, and actually part of this year is we're going to be doing a survey to get people's sort of written feedback on how we could be doing this better, essentially. But I think in broad terms, I've not heard anybody push back against the principle of having policies and procedures. Nobody's saying, get rid of it, it's just rubbish. So that's gratifying and reassuring. However, in terms of the challenges, there are implementation issues. So I was just in Kenya recently, and one of the meal officers there, she told me that she really likes the policies and procedures, but that she just couldn't apply the procedures to all of her projects. Even though she saw the value of it, she just couldn't get round them all. And if she did that, she wouldn't have time to do anything else. So, and she, you know, and I absolutely trust her. She's a terrific staff member. So it makes me think one of our measures, which is numbers of projects complying, is probably not a particularly good measure. The problem is the indicator of compliance. So perhaps, and this is still to be figured out, we need to think about, is there a better, cleverer way of tracking compliance, measuring where people are?
Is there not something in that though? Because I mean, when you're going through all of this kind of things, yes, it is additional work. So yes, there's all of the value. It's very worthwhile work, but there is a resource implication, so that it has to be resourced. Wasn't there one of the other indicators around the capacity of staff, but there's also then the number of staff.
Yep.
So I mean, you should be looking to make sure that all projects have it, but then maybe identify where needs are around ensuring that if it's not happening, why it's not happening, and what can be done.
Yeah, and we're probably, even though we're 2 years in, there's probably a transition still going on. Although we've said it only should apply to new projects, we're not looking to try and retrofit this or anything. I think it's just the sheer number of projects that she has to oversee. And just, you know, with new projects you get new staff, and this is all new, and there's a whole sort of effort implied this. So maybe, and I'm not saying this is the way, maybe we should be looking at, you know, percentage of country programme projects funding that's covered, that's compliant. So for example, if you have one really large project, you know, very high profile, etc., you really do want that to be compliant. The other little ones, ideally yes, but perhaps a lower priority if you really are struggling for it. So just being a bit cleverer about the way we're measuring it. The self-assessments, it's clearly just a subjective assessment, for better or worse. I think bringing attention to it, as you mentioned earlier, about having the conversation, I think the balance is it's worth doing. It's not we only do it once a year, and it generates the conversation. So I think on balance it's worth doing. The auditors are involved. They have a very limited scope of work. They just tell us whether or not something there truly is a tick box exercise, and we're working out whether there's more they can do, or this is about right, and so on. I think we touched on earlier, the process to evolve the policies and procedures over time it's good. We're aware that they need to evolve. So for example, this whole thing around adaptive management, do we need to bring that into the policies and procedures? Open data policy, all the conversations going on around that at the moment. How do we bring that in? What do we drop? Is it just et cetera, et cetera? So there's a whole conversation is, we recognise the need for them to evolve over time, but how do we manage that? And that's something we have to figure out. And of course, there's a lot of work involved in that. I mentioned earlier about the translated versions. Every time even small changes just becomes, you've got to figure out all the ways it ripples through. We've set up a service desk, so people, there's a special dedicated help desk, so people have questions, they can get answered there, and we can manage that knowledge. You know, you can tag the questions and the answers, and then it becomes a knowledge base. But obviously, we have to manage that. It has implications for our time to do that. One of the things that I thought, and this is, I think, is an interesting aspect, again, maybe there's just one, sorry, is that having got the policies and procedures, we've actually now linked them to a competency model. So for staff doing meal, whether they have it in their job title or whether it's just part of their programming work, so they've got some responsibilities for meal, we actually have used the policies and procedures to develop a competencies model for meal, so that staff know what we're expecting for different aspects of this work. Now, it doesn't align exactly with the policies and procedures, you can see, but there's quite a close alignment to it. So we've got competencies on design in meal, monitoring, evaluation, and so on and so forth, but we've got some things that don't quite fit in. But that's fine. So policies and procedures actually act as quite a good foundation for building a sort of a more coherent, if you like, thinking of the meal system idea. So a meal system involves staff doing meal, and so what competencies do you want them to have? So it's allowed us just to develop a competencies model, and now sort of we're going to move on to then looking at how do you interview for different levels of job and the competencies you expect them to have and so on. So you can start to build up a more complete and coherent picture. All of it takes time, but I think it becomes more of a holistic system. And another part of that is actually developing a curriculum. So they say, oh, that's fine, you've got policies and procedures, you've got competencies, how do we get this competency? So just starting to look at, we're in conversations with various people like American University and so on about a curriculum to support this, with the idea not to make it CRS specific. So I don't know if anybody's aware of a course called PMD Pro. Anybody come across that? Yeah. Project Manager. And there's now an FMD Pro. So the group that developed those courses, Lingos, now called Humentum, because they've joined forces with Mango and somebody else, I think. We're working with them on doing a foundational course called Meal Pro. So the idea is it would be generic for the sector, but obviously we have an interest in doing it for our particular purposes, and so on and so forth. So doing it for different levels of competencies. And then I think going on, well, this is slightly different, the onboarding. You know, you can use the policies and procedures to help with staff as they come on. One of the things that's really struck me is that with an agency where we have a fairly steady turnover of staff, particularly in the field, is it can be a blessing, so that all the baggage you thought might be associated with bringing in this big change, actually as new staff come on board, they say, oh, this is the way CRS does meal. Okay, that's the way I'll do it. You know, and so there's a sort of a silver lining in that particular cloud, if you understand what I mean.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
Just on the point about accepted by staff,
Yeah.
I'm sure you could correct me on this, but just the way it's written, it sounds almost like a little bit begrudging, you know, oh yeah, we accept this, we'll go along with it. I was just wondering whether you learnt anything about how to take it further than that, so it's enthusiastically embraced by staff. So, for example, instead of presenting it as policies and procedures, I'm wondering whether in addition to that you can present it as like a toolkit or a help point or something that would actually motivate people to want to go to it and find useful information there, and also the rules that they really have to follow.
Yeah.
But one of the things I was thinking about was how to present such a thing so that people would be motivated to go to it rather than feel compelled or coerced to go to it.
No, good point. Very good point. And I think one of the things that CRS does suffer from is staff feeling like there is a lot of stuff coming from on high, despite what I've said and attempts to roll it out in a way that's as inclusive as possible. But yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. Is there a way that we can present it in a more positive light, not just as something you have to do? But actually, I mean, I think we've tried to do that, but I'm sure we can do it better in terms of better. One of our principles is stewardship. Stewardship of resources and options for the poor and so on. So you can frame it in all of that kind of language, which is probably right. Actually, that would be quite helpful. That's a good suggestion. Thanks. So just the last thing then. So those are some successes and challenges. I don't know if you're aware of the Kinetic Framework. This whole thing around where we operate in different domains, and one of them, and I think where we are with the policies and procedures is I think we're operating in this complex domain, and what that means is that hand on heart, when we went in with this intervention to try and change things, we didn't really know what was going to happen. We'd done all the background work, we'd had the conversations and so on, but things are emerging, and you can see in this complex domain what you actually don't know. It's not a simple linear cause and effect kind of process. What you're really doing is probing, sensing and responding. So you're trying things out. And so I think with our initial policies and procedures, in effect what we're doing is we're probing, we're sort of seeing, and part of our work this year is really getting some substantive feedback on this so that we can make sense of the data and then respond accordingly, like things like indicators and so on and so forth. So being really attuned to emerging practices. And those emerging practices are, general acceptance of the need for word acceptance again, the need for policies and procedures, some positive responses from new recruits, certainly going to need updating in the light of implementation experiences. So what we're having to do this year is really figuring out how can we address this issue of workload without losing the sort of substance of the policies and procedures. And just like you mentioned, trying to make sure it's not just a tick box exercise. So are there things that we can put in place to just help us nudge us forward another step? Talked about updating in the light of the changing aid scene, so things never stand still. We've got these kinds of things on the horizon. There are other things, I'm sure, coming up. So how do we want to bring those into the policies and procedures? How does that fit with terms of the workload? So it's a balancing act, it's a judgment call for all of us. And what we're planning to do is really look at it quite closely this year as we go forward. So, if there's any questions or thoughts or comments, I mean, I can just, while you're thinking, if there's anything else. So I've shared with these are in draft, but I'm very happy to give these to IMA and they can share them out and so on. There was one other thing, just for what it's worth, is just a blog on the AEA site, the American Evaluation Association site, just about this. Just a little quick thing. Oh, sorry, yes.
Are you going to send out all of these materials?
Yeah, I'll send them to IMA and they can
Okay.
So
distribute.
we'll send it to the emails that we have on this list.
Sure, great, fabulous, thank you. The last thing is just some thoughts about takeaway messages as I was thinking about this. I think you shouldn't underestimate, this is a significant change in culture. And so, it goes on. It doesn't, it's not you do it 1 year and stop. This is an ongoing thing. It's the way you want the agency to work. It's the way the agency wants to work to be successful in doing the work that it does. So I think just mentioning that word organisational culture throws up all sorts of issues for how to do this well and less well and so on. So this isn't a small undertaking. I think it is a complex domain issue. I think it's this idea that you put some things out there. So one way, is to pilot some things on a very small scale, depending on how you're set up. Pilot it in one project or in a couple of locations, or however you figure that out, and monitor that closely. Get responses from people, and then learn from that, and then decide what the next step is. Give yourself time. There's no mad rush on this. Give yourself time to do this well. The Vice President who said, give yourself time to set it up right. You're absolutely right. Do it slowly, do it well, do it inclusively as much as you can, etc., etc. I think it's good advice. And related to that, plans won't necessarily lead where intended. Unintended, one of the things about the complex domain is for sure there are going to be unintended consequences. The challenge is you don't know what they're going to be in advance. And so you have to monitor. So like we're doing this survey this year, is monitor quite carefully. Not heavy, but enough so that you get enough insights to then be able to sort of make decisions on what an appropriate response is to what you're hearing and seeing. And I guess those are the key. We've probably covered this. In terms of the learning organisation, we do have, the learning policy in there, and one of the things there is about country programmes having a learning agenda. And another of the procedures is having annual learning events within a country programme, really to break down some of these silos, so that, just because you're on an agriculture project, actually people in nutrition may be really interested in what you're doing, if they're not already engaged in your project, etc. So it's really just trying to bring people together. And the challenge is everybody's really busy, and that means they sort of tend to stay in their own small area and just getting. So by making it a thing that at least once a year have some kind of learning event, and some countries have started off with just a half-day event. Others are now doing it 1 day, possibly even 2 days. Again, it just depends on what you can do. The imposition, that's I think a communication thing in part. It's being sensitive, it's really listening to people and then responding as you can. I think the harmonising, that's the point of doing this for us. It was about trying to have more harmony between what different projects are doing. I think we've probably covered these, but if there's anything I've not.
IT challenges.
The IT challenges, our challenge, I always tell everybody, I said we set up that site on SharePoint. I think we did an okay job despite SharePoint, because it's a beast to work with, and it's not particularly graphical, and it was at a time where we felt the agency was wanting to promote the use of SharePoint. Now they seem more liberal, and everybody else, luckily for them, is using other platforms. So one of our questions, over the next year is, do we actually want to change platform that's more graphical, more fun to use? SharePoint's just a beast. It's good for some things, but it's just, it's not the nicest thing to look at, frankly. It's very text heavy.
Sorry, does anyone have any platforms they like here at all? We know what the bad one is. I'm just wondering if anyone knows what a good one is.
The one we are using is Google. That's Google environment for frontline documents.
Right.
So we designed Google something.
I can find out the
it's
one.
It's not the best.
I can't remember the name we have a partnership and capacity strengthening group of, and they've done a lovely site actually. It just visually looks nice. It sort of draws you in, whereas I'm not entirely sure ours does. I'll find out what it's called. Sure. Yeah.
Got a question.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about the challenges of implementing a meal system. What impacts and outcomes have you seen or had from this process at the top level?
In terms of
informing strategy, and, the meal process feeding back into the learning process feeding back into decision making.
these particular policies and procedures are not intended to feed sort of high-level strategic decision-making. These are much more focused at project level, country program level, the way they do the monitoring and evaluation and learning for projects. So the successes there are terms of kind of responses we get back from when we put in proposals and talk about these and so on. So that's it. We haven't tried to do this aggregate. It was the thing I was talking earlier, this kind of common indicator, sort of trying to come up with high-level indicators. As I say, we've tended to sort of avoid that. We're under a lot of pressure to go that route, but we're just not convinced. There seem to be arguments against that, and the board are hopping up and down. We're sort of placating at the moment with these beneficiary and service delivery indicators. How long that will last, I'm not sure, but it's a big, expensive exercise, and as I say, I've not seen much evidence of the value of it. It's an argument we have to continue having because, the board, it sounds very plausible and very beguiling, but when you get into the weeds of it, I think there are some serious challenges with doing it and using the data, frankly. So this system isn't geared up for doing that.
At a more moderate level.
Yes, it's at a more sort of on the ground project level, really doing good project and program M&E. Yes.
You're seeing evidence of that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, most definitely. Good. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Guy. So thank you very much to Guy for this fantastic presentation. Stimulating some discussion, and I picked up a couple of things around this. One of the things early on was talking around M&E being more than in our discussion about more than just collecting data. It's about this making decisions and making good decisions. I think these are the questions coming at the end. Is that hopefully that's something that's coming out of that. And also for me, seeing we did a lot of work with knowledge management and seeing that in the centre of your matrix. I think that was really nice. I really liked that